something inside you has changed. There's something very strange that happens before a real transformation takes place. Nothing in your life seems dramatically different. Your job may still be the same. Your surroundings may still be the same. Your daily routines may still repeat as usual. But inside, something feels unfamiliar. You notice it in quiet moments, in the way certain conversations suddenly no longer interest you, in the way certain environments begin to feel heavier than they used to. Things that once excited you now feel far away. Things that once felt normal now feel slightly out of sync. And the confusing part is this: you can't clearly explain why. You haven't made any major decision. You haven't moved to a new city. You haven't completely rebuilt your life. And yet something inside you quietly whispers, I'm not the same person I used to be. The shift happens before the evidence. Most people go through this moment and immediately start doubting it. They assume nothing has changed because nothing visible has changed. But here is the paradox. Almost no one tells you the most important transformations in your life happen long before anyone else can see them, before the new life appears, before the new opportunities arrive, before a new version of you becomes visible. There is always an invisible shift. And if you've been feeling different lately, if something in you has become quieter, clearer, more distant from the things that once defined you, then it means something has already begun. And maybe that is why this phase feels so strange, because the outside world is still speaking to the old version of you, while something inside you is already moving on. People may still expect the same reactions from you, the same patterns, the same level of tolerance, the same personality they have always known. But inwardly, something has changed. You're no longer relating to life from the same place, and that creates friction. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because change often becomes real within you before it becomes visible around you. The confusion of invisible growth. The hardest kind of growth to trust is the kind that shows no obvious signs, because we live in a world that measures change through visible results. A promotion, a new relationship, a breakthrough, a dramatic reinvention. But real transformation rarely begins that way. It begins quietly, like winter underground. When you walk through a forest in winter, everything looks still. The trees are bare. The ground appears frozen. But beneath the surface, roots are reorganizing. Energy is being stored. Life is preparing. The forest is not dead. It is gathering strength. Your inner world works the same way. There are seasons when everything outside of you is moving, and there are seasons when all the movement is happening within. And that inner season can feel confusing, because the old version of you is slowly fading while the new version has not fully arrived yet. In that space between identities, things begin to shift. You question what you once accepted easily. Your goals become less clear. Your motivation changes. Your tolerance for certain relationships or situations fades. You may even become more inward, more aware. And that can feel unsettling, because the mind wants certainty. It wants to know who you are, where you're going, and what all of this means. But transformation rarely begins with clarity. It begins when what once worked no longer works, when what once distracted you no longer satisfies you, when what once felt like home starts to feel too small. That is often the first sign of growth. Not that you suddenly know where you're going, but that you can no longer pretend that where you are still fits. And that restlessness is not failure, it's awareness. The moment your soul begins to recognize the difference between comfort and alignment, because the two are not always the same. Sometimes what feels familiar is no longer true, and growth begins the moment you stop confusing familiarity with who you are meant to become. Why you feel different. When people talk about change, they often imagine one dramatic moment, a sudden realization that turns everything upside down overnight. But real psychological and spiritual growth rarely happens that way. It unfolds slowly. Carl Jung suggested the transformation begins when unconscious parts of us rise into awareness, not all at once, but gradually, quietly, like a sunrise you don't notice until the sky is already bright. Your perception shifts, and when perception changes, your experience of reality begins to change with it, because the life you experience is shaped by what you notice, what you accept, and what you believe is possible. So when your inner lens shifts, the outer world eventually begins to rearrange itself around it. But that rearrangement takes time. Think about the moon. Its phases change slowly. Night after night, the difference is almost invisible. But eventually, a crescent becomes a full moon. Personal evolution works the same way. Each moment of awareness, each time you pause instead of reacting, each time you choose growth over familiarity, you reshape who you are. And identity is the blueprint of your life. What changes your life is not only what you do, but who you are when you do it. Because before your habits change, your energy changes. Before your direction changes, your standards change. And before your life transforms, the way you see yourself begins to shift. And once that happens, even if nothing outside has changed yet, the transformation has already begun. The quiet signs that you've already shifted. A lot of people assume transformation has to come like a dramatic explosion. But in reality, it usually arrives in a silence so subtle, it feels ordinary. These are the small shifts that are easy to miss if you never slow down. The first sign, you begin to observe instead of react. Instead of instantly putting your defenses up when someone criticizes you, you step back and observe your own emotions first. For example, when someone tells you that you did something wrong, instead of rushing to explain yourself, you ask, why does this affect me so much? You begin to recognize your emotional triggers instead of letting them unconsciously control your behavior. You may also notice that you care less about proving your worth in front of other people. That need to explain every personal decision suddenly starts fading. For example, you choose a simpler lifestyle or a job that looks less impressive from the outside, and you feel okay with that without needing approval or even a nod of validation from anyone on social media. Certain arguments suddenly feel pointless. Certain loud social gatherings suddenly feel out of place. You start craving more quiet, more meaningful conversations, and more honesty, even when it comes in awkward or unpolished forms. At first, this journey can feel a lot like isolation because the environments and groups that once felt like your people no longer feel aligned. But understand this, the feeling of disconnection is often actually realignment. Imagine adjusting the frequency on an old radio. As the dial shifts toward a new station, the old one slowly fills with static and distorted noise. Not because the radio is broken or because the old station is wrong, but simply because you are no longer tuned to that frequency. That is why growth sometimes carries the feeling of loneliness. But this is not a loss of connection with the world. It is your inner signal being refined so it can find truer connections. And eventually, after all the static, new music begins to come through. People who share your values, opportunities that actually fit who you are, paths you were never quiet enough to notice before. But be patient, because before the new song begins, there is always a necessary silence where you learn how to listen to yourself. Another quiet sign is that you begin to feel tired in places where you used to perform easily. Not physically tired, soul tired. You notice how much energy it takes to shrink yourself, to pretend, to laugh when nothing feels funny, to stay available to what keeps draining you. And this exhaustion is not random. It is information. Your system is becoming less willing to betray itself just to maintain what is familiar. That is growth too. Not always glamorous, not always visible, but real. And sometimes one of the clearest signs that you've changed is that you can no longer comfortably return to who you used to be. The pause before life reorganizes. We tend to be afraid of quiet seasons. A lot of people mistake this still phase for regression. They think they are stuck, or worse, that life is leaving them behind. But what if the pause you are going through is actually a silent preparation? In nature, every great transformation requires deep stillness. A seed has to let the hard outer shell break apart in dark soil before it has the strength to reach for the light. A butterfly has to go through complete dissolution inside the cocoon, almost becoming liquid, before its wings can form. Even our brains work this way. Science calls it neuroplasticity. When you are trying to let go of an old habit that has been deeply wired into you, or when you are learning how to love yourself in a new way, your neural pathways do not change immediately. They reorganize in the silence of the subconscious. Think back to the times you felt empty after a major life event. Maybe after the end of a long relationship, or after walking away from a job that once felt like your identity. You feel suspended, no longer the old self, but not yet able to see the new one. That is not stagnation. That is not failure. That is the phase where the brain is erasing and rewriting. This process happens outside your conscious awareness. You do not feel your brain cells moving into place. You only suddenly notice the result on some ordinary day. A calmer reaction to criticism, a more compassionate view of your past mistakes, a stronger sense of steadiness when you have to be alone. So if lately you feel like you have suddenly slowed down, if your inner world has become deeper and less noisy, don't rush to force yourself to do something. Maybe this is not the confusion of someone who is lost. Maybe this is the restructuring of someone who is growing. Your life is not standing still. It is quietly rearranging the pieces around the most truthful version of who you are becoming. And sometimes life removes momentum on purpose, not to punish you, not to delay you, but to help you hear what constant movement was drowning out. Because when everything is noisy, it is easy to stay unconscious, easy to keep running on habit, easy to call distraction progress, easy to mistake constant motion for true direction. But in the pause, you hear more. You notice what hurts, what matters, what no longer belongs, what your spirit has been trying to tell you for a long time. The pause reveals, and what it reveals may not always be comfortable. You may see how long you abandoned your own needs, how often you shaped yourself around other people's expectations, how much of your life was built from survival not truth. But seeing clearly is not a setback. It is the beginning of freedom, because you cannot consciously build a new life while remaining unconscious to the patterns that shaped the old one. When the outer life starts to catch up at some point, the internal shift begins to show itself externally, not all at once, but in subtle ways at first. You make a different decision. You say no faster. You recover more quickly. You stop chasing what no longer feels aligned. You stop begging for clarity from places that only offer confusion. And then, one day, something clicks. A situation that would have consumed you a year ago barely shakes you now. A relationship dynamic that once controlled your emotions suddenly feels transparent. An opportunity you once would have forced no longer feels necessary. And in that moment, you realize the change was real all along. It was happening in the way you think, in the way you respond, in the things you no longer romanticize, in the things you finally refuse to settle for. This is how your next life begins. Not always with fireworks, but with a quieter kind of power. The power of no longer abandoning yourself. The power of no longer needing outer proof to trust an inner shift. The power of becoming someone who can hold what they once only hoped for. Because your life can only rise to the level of identity you are ready to embody. And maybe that is what has been changing. Maybe you are becoming the version of yourself your future has been waiting for. You have already changed. So if you've been feeling different lately, if something in you has become deeper, quieter, more still, don't rush to fix it. Don't assume something is wrong. You may simply be standing between the person you used to be and the person you are becoming. And that space is sacred, because it means the transformation has already started, even if no one can see it yet, even if you still can't explain it. Just like the moon never rushes through its phases, your evolution is unfolding in its own rhythm. Trust the quiet changes. Trust the subtle awareness. Trust the version of yourself that is slowly appearing from within. Because the life you were born to live always begins with the person you are becoming. And if this message found you at the exact moment you've been feeling this change, pause for a moment. Breathe. You are not lost. You are changing. And if this touched something in you deeper than logic, if it felt more like confirmation than information, then like and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but as a commitment to your own awakening. Because messages like this do not arrive by accident. They appear when something inside you is finally ready to hear them. And maybe that small difference you've been feeling lately is the beginning of your next life.